There is a quiet force shaping your life at every moment. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. Yet it influences your decisions, your relationships, your health, and even the opportunities you notice or ignore. That force is your thinking. Most people move through life believing that circumstances define them. They attribute success to luck, failure to misfortune, and stagnation to limitations imposed from the outside. But if you observe carefully, a different pattern begins to emerge. Two individuals can stand in the same environment, face the same constraints, and encounter the same challenges, yet produce entirely different outcomes. One advances, adapts, and grows stronger. The other hesitates, withdraws, and remains confined within the same boundaries. The distinction does not lie in the external world. It lies in how that world is interpreted. Positive thinking is often reduced to a simplistic idea, as if it were merely about maintaining a cheerful attitude or repeating reassuring phrases in difficult moments. This interpretation is not only incomplete, it is misleading. True positive thinking is neither naive nor detached from reality. It does not ignore difficulty, nor does it deny the presence of risk, failure, or uncertainty. Instead, it represents a deliberate and disciplined way of engaging with reality, one that expands your capacity to respond effectively rather than narrowing it. At its core, positive thinking is a cognitive skill. It is the ability to filter, frame, and respond to information in a manner that enhances performance and resilience. It is closely tied to how the brain processes uncertainty, evaluates threats, and constructs meaning. When this process is left unexamined, the mind defaults to patterns shaped by past experiences, many of which are inefficient or self-limiting. Over time, these patterns solidify into habitual ways of thinking that operate automatically, often without conscious awareness. This is why some individuals consistently anticipate failure even in situations where success is possible, while others identify opportunity in circumstances that appear restrictive. The difference is not a matter of personality or inherent disposition. It is the result of learned cognitive frameworks. Your thinking determines what captures your attention. It influences what you consider achievable and what you dismiss as impossible. It shapes your emotional responses under pressure and governs how long you persist when confronted with difficulty. Most importantly, it defines the narrative you construct about your own life, and that narrative quietly directs your behavior in ways that accumulate over time. If your thinking is unstructured, inconsistent, or dominated by negative bias, your actions will reflect that instability. Decisions become reactive rather than strategic. Effort becomes inconsistent. Progress becomes unpredictable. On the other hand, when thinking is deliberate and aligned with constructive interpretation, behavior becomes more precise, more controlled, and more effective. This book is not an exercise in motivation. It is an exploration of mental architecture. It examines how thoughts are formed, how they influence perception, and how they can be systematically refined. You will not be asked to ignore reality or to replace it with artificial optimism. Instead, you will learn how to interpret reality in a way that preserves clarity while maximizing your ability to act. There is a fundamental shift that occurs when you begin to observe your own thinking rather than simply experiencing it. Thoughts lose their authority as absolute truths and become data points that can be evaluated, challenged, and modified. This shift creates distance between stimulus and response, and within that distance lies the capacity for control. Control does not mean eliminating negative thoughts entirely. Such an expectation is unrealistic and counterproductive. Instead, control refers to the ability to prevent those thoughts from dictating your behavior or defining your perspective. It allows you to acknowledge difficulty without being overwhelmed by it, to recognize risk without becoming paralyzed, and to encounter failure without internalizing it as identity. Individuals who operate effectively under pressure are not free from doubt or uncertainty. They experience the same internal fluctuations as everyone else. What differentiates them is their ability to manage those fluctuations in real time. They do not allow temporary mental states to produce permanent consequences. The art of positive thinking, therefore, is not about eliminating negativity. It is about structuring your thinking in a way that ensures negativity does not dominate your interpretation of events. As you move forward, you will begin to recognize patterns that previously went unnoticed. You will see how certain thoughts lead predictably to certain behaviors, and how those behaviors reinforce the very thoughts that produced them. This feedback loop is central to understanding why change can feel difficult. It is not simply a matter of deciding to think differently. It requires interrupting established patterns and replacing them with alternatives that are both realistic and functional. This process demands awareness, but it also demands precision. Vague intentions to be more positive are ineffective because they lack operational clarity. What matters is not the intention, but the method. How do you identify unproductive thought patterns? How do you evaluate their validity? How do you replace them without falling into denial or distortion? These are the questions that define this work. By the time you reach the end of this book, your objective will not be to feel positive at all times. That would be both unrealistic and unnecessary. Instead, your objective will be to think in a way that consistently supports effective action, regardless of external conditions. Because ultimately, your life is not shaped by what happens to you. It is shaped by how you think about what happens to you. And once that changes, everything else begins to follow. But beneath the surface, there is a system at work, one that continuously processes information, assigns meaning, and generates responses. To understand positive thinking in a meaningful way, you must first understand this system. The mind does not respond directly to events. It responds to interpretations of events. This distinction is subtle but critical. When something happens, whether it is a conversation, a setback, or an unexpected opportunity, the brain does not simply register the occurrence and move forward. Instead, it immediately begins to evaluate the situation. It asks, often unconsciously, what this means, whether it is beneficial or harmful, and what should be done next. This evaluation process is influenced by prior experiences, learned beliefs, and existing expectations. Over time, these influences form a network of cognitive patterns that shape how new information is processed. When similar situations arise, the brain relies on these patterns to produce rapid interpretations, allowing for quick decision-making without the need for deliberate analysis. While this efficiency is useful, it comes with a cost. If the underlying patterns are inaccurate or overly negative, the interpretations they produce will also be distorted. This is how individuals can consistently perceive threat where none exists or failure where the situation is neutral. The mind is not reacting to reality as it is, but to a version of reality filtered through existing assumptions. This is the foundation of negative thinking patterns. They are not random occurrences, but predictable outcomes of established cognitive frameworks. For example, if an individual holds an underlying belief that they are not capable, this belief will influence how they interpret challenges. A difficult task will not be seen as an opportunity to develop skill, but as confirmation of inadequacy. Even neutral feedback can be interpreted as criticism, reinforcing the original belief. Over time, this creates a self-sustaining cycle in which thought patterns and experiences continuously validate each other. Breaking this cycle requires more than effort. It requires awareness of the structure itself. The first step is recognizing that thoughts are not inherently accurate. They feel immediate and convincing, but they are constructed. They are influenced by variables that may not be relevant to the present situation. When you begin to question the validity of your thoughts, you create an opportunity to alter their impact. This does not mean rejecting thoughts indiscriminately. It means evaluating them with a degree of objectivity. Is the interpretation supported by evidence, or is it based on assumption? Is it helping you respond effectively, or is it limiting your options? These questions introduce a level of scrutiny that disrupts automatic thinking. They slow down the process, allowing for deliberate intervention. Over time, this intervention becomes more efficient, and new patterns begin to form. Positive thinking emerges from this restructuring process. It is not imposed artificially, but developed through repeated adjustments in how situations are interpreted. Instead of defaulting to worst-case assumptions, the mind learns to consider multiple possibilities. Instead of viewing difficulty as a fixed barrier, it begins to see it as variable and potentially manageable. This shift does not eliminate uncertainty, it changes your relationship with it. When uncertainty is interpreted as threat, it produces hesitation and avoidance. When it is interpreted as possibility, it encourages exploration and action. The external situation remains the same, but the internal response is fundamentally different. Over time, these differences accumulate. Small changes in interpretation lead to small changes in behavior. Those behavioral changes produce different outcomes, which in turn reinforce the new patterns of thinking. This is how transformation occurs, not through sudden realization, but through consistent adjustment. Understanding the architecture of thought gives you access to this process. It allows you to identify where change is needed and how to implement it. Without this understanding, attempts to think positively remain superficial and unsustainable. With it, they become systematic and precise. And that is where real change begins. Chapter 1. Every thought that enters your mind follows a structure, whether you are aware of it or not. It is easy to assume that thinking is spontaneous, that ideas simply appear without order or pattern. But this assumption does not hold under closer examination. Beneath the surface, there is a continuous process at work, one that receives input from the environment, filters it through existing beliefs, assigns meaning, and produces a response. This process operates with remarkable speed, often so quickly that it feels as though the thought itself is reality, rather than a constructed interpretation of it. To understand positive thinking in a meaningful and professional sense, you must first understand this internal architecture. Without that understanding, any attempt to think differently becomes temporary and unstable, because it does not address the underlying mechanism that produces thoughts in the first place. The mind does not respond directly to events. It responds to interpretations of events. This distinction is subtle, but it is foundational. When something happens, whether it is a conversation, a professional setback, a missed opportunity, or an unexpected challenge, the brain does not simply record the event and move forward. Instead, it immediately evaluates the situation. It asks what this means, whether it is beneficial or harmful, and what implications it carries for the future. This evaluation is automatic, and in most cases, it is unconscious. What makes this process complex is that the evaluation is not neutral. It is shaped by prior experiences, internal beliefs, emotional conditioning, and learned expectations. Over time, these influences form cognitive patterns that determine how new situations are interpreted. The brain relies on these patterns because they allow for rapid decision-making. Instead of analyzing each situation from the beginning, it applies pre-existing frameworks to generate quick conclusions. This efficiency is essential for survival, but it is not always accurate. If the underlying patterns are distorted, overly negative, or based on outdated experiences, the interpretations they produce will also be flawed. This is how individuals can repeatedly misinterpret neutral or even positive situations as negative. The issue is not the situation itself, but the framework through which it is being viewed. Consider a simple example. Two individuals receive the same piece of feedback in a professional setting. The feedback is constructive, intended to improve performance. One individual interprets it as useful information, something that can be applied to refine their approach. The other interprets it as criticism, as evidence of inadequacy. The external event is identical, yet the internal responses are entirely different. One response leads to growth, the other to self-doubt and hesitation. This divergence is not accidental. It is the direct result of how each individual's thinking is structured. Negative thinking patterns do not appear randomly. They are built over time through repetition and reinforcement. When a particular interpretation is applied repeatedly, it becomes the default response. The brain begins to favor that interpretation because it is familiar, even if it is not accurate or beneficial. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Thoughts influence behavior. Behavior produces outcomes, and those outcomes reinforce the original thoughts. If an individual consistently interprets challenges as evidence of failure, they are more likely to avoid those challenges. This avoidance limits experience and reduces opportunities for improvement, which then appears to confirm the belief that they are not capable. The cycle continues, becoming more entrenched with each repetition. Breaking this cycle requires more than effort or intention. It requires awareness of the process itself. You cannot change what you do not recognize. Most people attempt to control their thinking at the level of individual thoughts, trying to replace negative ideas with positive ones in a direct and immediate way. While this can produce temporary relief, it does not address the deeper structure that generates those thoughts. As a result, the same patterns reappear under stress or pressure. A more effective approach begins with observation. Instead of reacting to each thought as it arises, you begin to examine it. You ask where it comes from, what assumptions it is based on, and whether those assumptions are valid. This creates a separation between you and your thoughts. Rather than being controlled by them, you become an observer of them. This shift is subtle, but it is powerful. It introduces a level of cognitive distance that allows for evaluation and adjustment. Thoughts lose their status as unquestionable truths and become hypotheses that can be tested. This does not mean rejecting all negative thoughts. Some negative interpretations are accurate and necessary. The goal is not to eliminate negativity, but to ensure that it is proportionate, evidence-based, and constructive. Positive thinking, in its most effective form, emerges from this evaluative process. It is not about forcing the mind into optimism. It is about refining the way interpretations are formed so that they are aligned with reality while still supporting effective action. This requires precision. An overly optimistic interpretation that ignores risk is just as problematic as an overly negative one that exaggerates it. Both lead to poor decision-making. The objective is balance, but not a passive balance. It is an active, deliberate alignment between perception and function. A thought is useful if it enables you to respond effectively to a situation. It is unhelpful if it restricts your ability to act, regardless of whether it feels positive or negative. This is where many misunderstand the concept of positive thinking. They assume it is about maintaining a certain emotional state, about feeling confident, calm, or optimistic at all times. In reality, emotions fluctuate naturally and cannot be controlled with complete consistency. What can be controlled, however, is the interpretation that generates those emotions. When interpretations change, Emotional responses begin to follow. If a challenge is interpreted as a threat, it produces anxiety and avoidance. If the same challenge is interpreted as an opportunity to develop skill, it produces engagement and effort. The external conditions remain unchanged, but the internal experience shifts significantly. Over time, these shifts accumulate. Small adjustments in interpretation lead to small adjustments in behavior. Those behavioral changes produce different outcomes, which then reinforce the new patterns of thinking. This is how long-term change occurs. It is gradual, systematic, and grounded in repeated practice. Another critical aspect of thought architecture is attention. What you focus on influences what you think about, and what you think about influences how you feel and act. The mind has a limited capacity for attention, which means it must prioritize certain information over others. This prioritization is not random. It is guided by existing beliefs and expectations. If you expect difficulty, your attention will naturally gravitate toward obstacles. If you expect opportunity, your attention will be more likely to detect possibilities. This does not mean that one perspective is correct and the other is not. It means that your expectations shape your perception of reality in a way that influences your behavior. This creates another feedback loop. Attention influences interpretation. Interpretation influences behavior, and behavior influences outcomes. By adjusting where your attention is directed, you begin to influence the entire system. Developing control over attention is therefore a central component of positive thinking. It involves consciously directing focus toward information that is relevant, constructive, and actionable, rather than allowing it to be captured by default patterns of concern or doubt. This is not an immediate process. The mind will resist change, particularly when existing patterns have been reinforced over long periods. There will be moments when old interpretations reappear automatically, especially under stress. This is not a sign of failure. It is a reflection of how deeply those patterns have been embedded. What matters is consistency. Each time you observe, evaluate, and adjust a thought, you are reinforcing a new pattern. Over time, these new patterns become more accessible, and the old ones begin to weaken. The process is gradual, but it is reliable. Understanding the architecture of thought provides a framework for this transformation. It moves the concept of positive thinking from abstraction to application. It replaces vague intentions with specific mechanisms that can be observed, analyzed, and refined. By the end of this chapter, the objective is not to have eliminated negative thinking. That is neither realistic nor necessary. The objective is to recognize that thoughts are constructed, that they follow identifiable patterns, and that those patterns can be influenced with deliberate effort. Once this recognition is established, the process of change becomes not only possible, but practical. And that is where the real work begins. Chapter 2. If the first step in mastering positive thinking is understanding how thoughts are structured, the second is understanding how those structures become biased. The human mind is not a neutral processor of information. It is designed for survival, not accuracy. And this distinction explains why negative thinking can feel so automatic, so convincing, and so difficult to override. From an evolutionary perspective, the brain developed to detect threats quickly and respond to them efficiently. Missing a potential danger carried a higher cost than overreacting to a harmless situation. As a result, the mind became highly sensitive to anything that could be interpreted as risk, failure, rejection, or loss. This sensitivity remains active, even in environments where immediate physical threats are rare. It influences how situations are evaluated, often amplifying the negative aspects while minimizing or ignoring the positive ones. This tendency is known as negative bias, and it is embedded deeply within cognitive processing. It affects attention, memory, and interpretation simultaneously. You are more likely to notice criticism than praise, more likely to remember failure than success, and more likely to interpret ambiguity as a problem rather than a possibility. This is not a personal flaw. It is a default setting. However, what is natural is not always useful. In modern contexts, where success often depends on long-term thinking, adaptability, and sustained effort, an unchecked negative bias can become a limitation. It narrows perception, reduces confidence, and encourages avoidance, behaviors that restrict growth. Over time, it creates a mental environment in which opportunities are overlooked and challenges are perceived as insurmountable. To develop effective positive thinking, you must first recognize how this bias operates in real time. Consider how quickly the mind generates conclusions. A single comment can lead to assumptions about competence. A minor setback can be interpreted as a pattern of failure. A delay can be seen as rejection. These interpretations occur almost instantly, often without conscious evaluation. Once formed, they influence emotional responses and behavior before there is an opportunity to question their accuracy. This is where most people lose control of their thinking. They accept the first interpretation as the correct one. But the first interpretation is not always the most accurate. It is simply the fastest. Professional thinking requires a different approach. It involves slowing down the interpretive process just enough to introduce evaluation. When a thought arises, instead of accepting it immediately, you examine it. You consider alternative explanations. You ask whether the conclusion is supported by sufficient evidence or whether it is driven by assumption. This process does not eliminate negative thoughts, but it changes their impact. A thought that is examined loses some of its authority. It becomes one possibility among many, rather than a definitive statement about reality. Over time, this practice weakens the influence of negative bias. The mind begins to recognize that its initial interpretations are not always reliable, and it becomes more open to alternative perspectives. This shift is gradual, but it is measurable in behavior. Decisions become less reactive, responses become more controlled, and actions become more aligned with long-term objectives. The way you internally describe situations has a direct impact on how those situations are perceived. Language is not just a tool for communication. It is a tool for cognition. The words you use shape the meaning you assign to events. When a situation is described in absolute terms, it creates a sense of permanence and certainty. A mistake becomes a failure. A delay becomes a rejection. A challenge becomes an obstacle. These descriptions limit interpretation and reduce flexibility. They make situations appear more rigid than they actually are. In contrast, when language is precise and measured, it allows for a more accurate assessment. A mistake becomes a data point. A delay becomes a variable. A challenge becomes a condition that can be analyzed and addressed. This does not change the external reality, but it changes how that reality is processed. This shift in language is a key component of positive thinking. It replaces exaggeration with accuracy and assumption with analysis. It creates space for problem-solving rather than reinforcing limitation. Emotional responses are also deeply connected to this process. Emotions are not random. They are generated by interpretations. When a situation is interpreted as threatening, the body responds with stress. When it is interpreted as manageable, the response is more controlled. By adjusting the interpretation, you influence the emotional outcome. This does not mean suppressing emotions. Suppression is temporary and often counterproductive. Instead, The objective is to understand the source of the emotion and address it at the level of interpretation. When the underlying thought changes, the emotional response adjusts naturally. For example, anxiety before a new challenge is often interpreted as a sign of inadequacy. This interpretation increases discomfort and reduces performance. However, if the same physiological response is interpreted as preparation, as the body mobilizing resources for action, the experience changes. The sensation remains similar, but its meaning is different, and that difference affects behavior. This ability to reframe internal experiences is a defining characteristic of effective thinkers. It allows them to operate under pressure without being overwhelmed by it. They do not eliminate discomfort. They reinterpret it in a way that supports action. Another dimension of negative bias is its impact on expectation. What you expect influences what you notice and how you respond. If you expect failure, you are more likely to detect signs that confirm that expectation. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The expectation shapes perception, perception shapes behavior, and behavior produces outcomes that align with the original expectation. Breaking this cycle requires intentional disruption. You do not replace negative expectations with unrealistic optimism. Instead, you introduce balanced expectations that are grounded in possibility. You acknowledge risk, but you also acknowledge the potential for success. This creates a more flexible mental framework, one that allows for adaptation rather than rigid prediction. Consistency is essential in this process. A single adjustment in thinking will not produce lasting change. The mind operates through repetition, and new patterns must be reinforced repeatedly before they become automatic. This requires patience and persistence. There will be moments when old patterns reassert themselves, particularly in unfamiliar or high-pressure situations. This is expected. What matters is not the absence of negative thoughts, but the response to them. Each time you choose to evaluate rather than react, to analyze rather than assume, you are strengthening a different way of thinking. Over time, this becomes the default. The mind becomes more stable, more precise, and more aligned with effective action. Positive thinking, in this context, is not an abstract concept. It is a trained cognitive function. It is developed through awareness, refined through practice, and maintained through consistency. It does not ignore reality. It engages with it more effectively. As this chapter concludes, the focus shifts from understanding bias to actively restructuring it. Recognizing the presence of negative bias is necessary, but it is only the beginning. The next step is to develop methods for replacing unproductive patterns with ones that are both realistic and advantageous. Because, once you understand how your thinking is biased, you are no longer controlled by it. You are in a position to change it. Chapter 3. Once you recognize that your thinking is structured and biased, the next stage is far more demanding. Awareness alone does not produce change. It creates the possibility of change, but without deliberate intervention, the same patterns continue to operate. The mind does not reorganize itself simply because you understand it. It requires consistent, targeted adjustment. At this stage, the objective is not observation, but restructuring. Cognitive patterns are formed through repetition. Every time a particular interpretation is applied to a situation, it becomes slightly more accessible the next time a similar situation arises. Over time, this accessibility turns into automaticity. The thought appears quickly, feels familiar, and is accepted without question. This is why certain reactions seem inevitable, even when they are not. To change this, you must interrupt the automatic process and introduce an alternative. The interruption is the most critical point. Without it, the existing pattern completes its cycle before you have the opportunity to influence it. With it, You create a brief window in which conscious thought can intervene. This window may be small at first, but it expands with practice. The interruption begins with recognition. You notice the thought as it forms, rather than after it has already influenced your behavior. This requires attention because automatic thoughts are subtle. They do not present themselves as optional interpretations. They present themselves as facts. When you begin to identify them consistently, you gain access to the next step, which is evaluation. Evaluation requires a different mindset than reaction. Instead of accepting the thought, you examine it. You assess its accuracy, its assumptions, and its implications. You ask whether it is supported by evidence or driven by bias. You consider whether it is helping you respond effectively or limiting your ability to act. This process introduces friction into the system. It slows down the automatic response and replaces it with deliberate analysis. At first, this may feel unnatural. The mind prefers speed and efficiency, even at the cost of accuracy. Deliberate thinking requires effort, and effort is something the brain naturally tries to conserve. However, with repetition, this effort decreases. What begins as a conscious process gradually becomes more efficient, eventually integrating into your default way of thinking. After evaluation comes replacement. This is where many approaches fail. They attempt to replace negative thoughts with positive ones without considering whether the replacement is credible. If the new thought is too far removed from reality, the mind rejects it. It does not integrate into the cognitive system because it conflicts with existing beliefs. Effective replacement must be both constructive and believable. Instead of moving from a negative extreme to an unrealistic positive, the adjustment should move toward a balanced interpretation. If a thought suggests complete failure, the replacement does not need to assert guaranteed success. It needs to introduce a more accurate perspective, one that acknowledges uncertainty while preserving the possibility of a positive outcome. This type of replacement is more stable because it aligns with observable reality. It does not require the mind to ignore evidence. It requires the mind to interpret evidence more precisely. Over time, these adjusted interpretations begin to accumulate. Each one reinforces a slightly different pattern. As these patterns are repeated, they become more accessible, eventually replacing the original automatic responses. This is the process through which cognitive restructuring occurs. It is not immediate. It is iterative. Another essential component of restructuring is consistency across contexts. It is not enough to adjust thinking in controlled or low-pressure situations. The true test occurs under stress, when the mind is more likely to revert to established patterns. This is why practice must be continuous. The goal is to make the new patterns robust enough to function even when conditions are unfavorable. This requires a level of discipline that is often underestimated. Changing thought patterns is not a single decision. It is a repeated action performed across multiple situations until it becomes embedded. The process is similar to developing any complex skill. Initial progress may be slow, and there may be periods where improvement is not immediately visible. However, with sustained effort, the changes become more pronounced. An important factor in this process is emotional tolerance. When you begin to challenge negative thoughts, you may still experience the emotions associated with them. This can create the impression that the restructuring is not working. In reality, emotional responses often lag behind cognitive changes. The mind may begin to interpret situations differently before the emotional system fully adjusts. This delay is normal. It does not indicate failure. What matters is maintaining the new pattern despite the temporary persistence of old emotional responses. Over time, as the new interpretations are reinforced, the emotional responses begin to align with them. Another challenge in restructuring is the tendency to revert to familiar patterns during uncertainty. The brain seeks predictability, and familiar patterns, even if negative, provide a sense of stability. When you introduce new ways of thinking, there may be resistance. The mind may attempt to return to its previous state because it is more comfortable, even if it is less effective. Understanding this resistance is important. It is not a sign that the new approach is incorrect. It is a natural response to change. By anticipating it, you can maintain consistency rather than interpreting it as a reason to stop. Over time, as the new patterns become more familiar, this resistance decreases. The mind begins to accept them as the default, and the effort required to maintain them is reduced. Attention also plays a critical role in restructuring. Where you direct your focus influences which thoughts are reinforced. If attention remains fixed on negative interpretations, those patterns continue to strengthen. By consciously directing attention toward constructive and actionable aspects of a situation, you support the development of new patterns. This does not mean ignoring problems. It means engaging with them in a way that is oriented toward resolution rather than reinforcement of limitation. The focus shifts from what is wrong to what can be done. This shift is subtle, but it has significant implications. It changes the function of thinking from passive reaction to active problem solving. As this process continues, a noticeable change occurs in how situations are experienced. Challenges that once triggered immediate negative responses begin to feel more manageable. Uncertainty becomes less threatening. Decision-making becomes more deliberate. These changes are not the result of external circumstances improving, but of internal processes becoming more effective. This is the essence of cognitive restructuring. It is not about creating a different reality. It is about engaging with the same reality in a more effective way. By the end of this chapter, the objective is to understand that change in thinking is not achieved through intention alone. It requires a structured approach that includes recognition, evaluation, and replacement. It requires consistency across situations and tolerance for temporary discomfort. Most importantly, it requires the willingness to question thoughts that feel certain. Because certainty is not always accuracy, and when you learn to challenge that certainty, you gain the ability to reshape it. Chapter 4. With an understanding of how thoughts are structured, biased, and subject to deliberate restructuring, the next step is mastery of application. Knowledge alone is not sufficient. The true power of positive thinking emerges when the framework is applied consistently to real-world situations. This is where theory becomes practice and where abstract principles begin to influence measurable outcomes. The first principle of application is situational awareness. Every situation presents multiple possible interpretations. Your default pattern will often prioritize threat, failure, or limitation. To counteract this, you must learn to observe the situation with clarity, noting both opportunities and challenges without premature judgment. This requires slowing down the cognitive process just enough to create space for deliberate choice. It is not about overanalyzing. It is about registering facts before assigning meaning. The ability to distinguish between observable events and subjective interpretation is critical because it determines the quality of every subsequent thought and decision. Once awareness is established, the second principle is adaptive framing. Adaptive framing is the deliberate act of choosing interpretations that support action rather than inhibition. This does not mean ignoring risk or pretending challenges do not exist. Instead, it is the skill of interpreting reality in ways that preserve clarity while maximizing potential for constructive response. For instance, a professional setback is not merely a failure to be avoided. It can be reframed as information that identifies gaps, teaches lessons, and refines strategy. The same objective fact, the setback, yields different outcomes depending on the mental frame applied. The third principle is behavioral alignment. Thought without action is incomplete. Positive thinking is effective only when it leads to consistent, purposeful behavior. When you interpret a challenge constructively, you must follow with action that is coherent with that interpretation. Cognitive restructuring alone does not generate results. It sets the stage for decisions and efforts that produce tangible outcomes. This alignment between thought and action ensures that the mind's recalibration has practical impact, reinforcing the new patterns and reducing the likelihood of regression. An essential part of application is feedback integration. Every action generates results, and those results provide data for refining future thinking. Positive thinking is iterative. It requires continuous evaluation of outcomes against expectations. When a strategy produces the desired outcome, it strengthens the mental framework that generated it. When it produces an unexpected result, it provides an opportunity to adjust interpretations, refine assumptions, and calibrate future responses. This feedback loop is critical because it ties cognition directly to experience, ensuring that thinking is grounded in reality rather than ideology or wishful thinking. Resilience is another crucial component. Situations will not always conform to expectations. Setbacks, uncertainty, and unforeseen complications are inevitable. The effectiveness of positive thinking is not measured by the absence of difficulty, but by the ability to navigate it without losing composure or direction. Resilience emerges from repeated exposure to challenge while maintaining deliberate cognitive control. The mind learns to operate effectively under pressure, recognizing that negative outcomes are temporary and informational rather than definitive judgments. Consistency across contexts also strengthens application. Patterns that are developed in one domain, professional, personal, or academic, can be generalized to other domains if the underlying principles are maintained. This is why deliberate practice in varied environments is crucial. The mind does not compartmentalize adaptive thinking by context automatically. It requires intentional repetition and reinforcement to become a default mode across situations. An often overlooked element is temporal perspective. Positive thinking is enhanced when the mind considers both short-term and long-term consequences. Immediate emotional reactions often dominate initial responses, but the ability to step back and evaluate outcomes over time changes decision-making. For instance, a reaction that feels urgent and threatening may appear manageable when viewed from a broader temporal frame. This allows for interventions that are more strategic, measured, and effective. Emotional regulation remains intertwined with cognitive application. Even when interpretations are accurate and deliberate, the body and mind generate emotional responses that can be intense or disruptive. Recognizing that emotions are indicators rather than commands allows for action without being dominated by them. Anxiety, frustration, and doubt can coexist with effective action when they are acknowledged but not allowed to override deliberate decision-making. Finally, mastery of application depends on self-reinforcement. The mind must internalize the connection between deliberate thinking and tangible outcomes. Each success reinforces the process, gradually reducing the effort required for conscious intervention. Over time, constructive interpretations and aligned behaviors become the default, producing a state in which positive thinking operates automatically, reliably, and with precision. At the conclusion of this chapter, the reader should understand that application is where abstract knowledge of positive thinking becomes a measurable force in life. It requires situational awareness, adaptive framing, behavioral alignment, iterative feedback, resilience, context generalization, temporal perspective, emotional regulation, and consistent reinforcement. These principles are not optional. They are the operational mechanics that convert understanding into actionable, sustainable, and professional-level mastery of the art of positive thinking. It is within this deliberate application that the transformation of thinking into tangible results occurs, and where the difference between passive hope and professional cognitive mastery is realized. Chapter 5. After understanding how to structure, recognize, and apply thoughts, the next level of positive thinking is optimization. This is where thinking moves beyond correction and control into efficiency, precision, and scalability. It is no longer enough to simply interrupt negative patterns or replace them with balanced interpretations. Optimization focuses on enhancing cognitive performance to maximize insight, creativity, and decision-making in every context. Optimization begins with clarity of intention. Every thought, every interpretation, and every action must be linked to a clearly defined objective. Without clear intent, the mind drifts, and even the most refined cognitive patterns are wasted on irrelevant concerns. Intent serves as a guiding principle, directing attention, shaping interpretation, and influencing behavior toward meaningful outcomes. When objectives are explicit, the cognitive system can prioritize inputs and allocate mental resources efficiently. This is not about rigid planning. It is about aligning mental energy with strategic focus. Next is prioritization of inputs. The mind constantly receives a flood of sensory, emotional, and informational stimuli. Positive thinking does not imply ignoring difficult information, but it requires selecting inputs that are actionable, relevant, and aligned with the intended outcomes. Filtering becomes a deliberate skill. Information that is distracting, speculative, or emotionally amplifying, but non-constructive, is acknowledged but deprioritized. This selective attention ensures that thinking resources are concentrated on the variables that actually influence results. Integration of analytical rigor is the third pillar of optimization. Thoughts must not only be constructive, they must also be precise. This involves systematically evaluating evidence, testing assumptions, and modeling potential outcomes. Positive thinking in its highest form is analytical as much as it is interpretive. It relies on logic and empirical understanding to structure interpretations, rather than merely relying on hope or intuition. Optimized thinking creates scenarios, anticipates challenges, and identifies leverage points that others may overlook. Time management within cognitive processes is another crucial aspect. Optimized thinking recognizes that mental resources are finite and must be allocated strategically. Complex or emotionally charged situations are approached with deliberate pacing, while routine or repetitive processes are handled efficiently to preserve energy for higher-value cognitive tasks. This ensures that thinking is not scattered or exhausted, but focused and sustainable across extended periods of engagement. Another dimension of optimization is adaptability. Even the most refined cognitive patterns cannot predict every variable. Positive thinking at this level incorporates contingency planning and flexible interpretation. It acknowledges uncertainty without paralysis, allowing rapid recalibration of thought and action in response to new information. Adaptability enhances resilience, reduces wasted effort, and ensures that cognitive strategies remain effective under dynamic conditions. Reflection is an additional mechanism of optimization. After each decision or action, structured reflection evaluates both the process and the outcome. What interpretations were accurate? Which assumptions were faulty? How well did attention align with objectives? Reflection converts experience into knowledge, reinforcing effective patterns while identifying areas for refinement. This iterative process is essential because it creates continuous improvement rather than static proficiency. Interpersonal dynamics also influence optimization. The way you interpret and respond to others' behavior affects outcomes in collaborative contexts. Optimized thinking anticipates perspectives, evaluates motives objectively, and integrates social intelligence into decision-making. Misinterpretation or overreaction can squander cognitive efficiency, while accurate, measured assessment preserves focus and strengthens influence. Visualization and mental rehearsal are additional tools. Anticipating scenarios, simulating decisions, and mentally practicing responses improve speed, accuracy, and confidence in real situations. The mind becomes trained to respond effectively before the stimulus occurs. This proactive approach enhances performance and reduces reliance on reactive thinking, which is often biased or suboptimal. Finally, self-regulation is a cornerstone of optimization. This encompasses emotional, cognitive, and behavioral regulation, ensuring that energy, focus, and response are aligned with goals. Optimized thinking is not about eliminating stress or discomfort. It is about harnessing internal states to serve performance. Emotions are treated as data rather than directives, and mental effort is directed towards structured evaluation, strategic alignment, and deliberate action. By mastering optimization, the practice of positive thinking reaches a professional level. Thoughts are not only constructive, they are precise, aligned, adaptive, and efficient. Decisions are faster, responses are more measured, and results become more consistent. What distinguishes optimized thinking from basic cognitive restructuring is its predictive, scalable, and strategic nature. At the end of this chapter, the reader should recognize that optimization is the transition from competent cognitive management to mastery. It is the stage where every thought, interpretation, and action is leveraged for maximum effect. It is no longer about reaction or balance. It is about controlled, high-performance thinking that produces consistent, measurable, and professional-level outcomes. This is the level at which the art of positive thinking transcends personal improvement and becomes a tool for sustained excellence in any endeavor. Chapter 6. By the time you reach this stage, positive thinking has moved from awareness to restructuring, application, and optimization. The next essential element is integration, embedding this approach into daily life so that it becomes automatic, fluid, and sustainable. Without integration, even the most sophisticated cognitive strategies remain episodic, applied inconsistently, and vulnerable to regression under pressure. Integration ensures that the principles of positive thinking are not just practiced, they are lived. Integration begins with routine. The mind thrives on repetition. Habits are the infrastructure that supports sustained cognitive patterns. By embedding deliberate thought exercises, reflection, and evaluative practices into daily routines, you reinforce desired patterns consistently. This creates a stable foundation, making constructive interpretation the default rather than an effortful exception. Over time, behaviors and thoughts merge seamlessly, reducing cognitive friction and conserving mental energy for novel challenges. A critical part of integration is environmental alignment. The surroundings you engage with, physical, social, and informational, directly influence cognitive patterns. Exposure to negativity, disorganization, or conflicting messages can weaken positive thinking, while supportive environments enhance it. This does not imply avoidance of challenge. It means curating inputs that reinforce constructive, actionable thinking. For instance, interactions with analytical and solution-oriented individuals, engagement with high-quality information, and physical spaces that encourage focus all support mental integration. Integration also requires temporal structuring. Positive thinking is strengthened when attention and practice are distributed across time rather than concentrated sporadically. Consistent mental rehearsal, reflection, and application at strategic intervals reinforce neural pathways, gradually making adaptive thinking automatic. This temporal consistency transforms effortful intervention into instinctive response. Situations that once triggered immediate negative bias now elicit deliberate, constructive interpretation with minimal conscious effort. Another dimension is cross-contextual reinforcement. Skills developed in one domain, professional, personal, or social, can reinforce others if consciously applied. For example, structured evaluation used in professional decision-making can improve personal problem solving, while emotional regulation in social interactions strengthens resilience under workplace stress. Integration is maximized when cognitive strategies are generalized across domains, making the mind consistently effective regardless of context. Mindful monitoring is also essential. Integration does not mean passive absorption of thought patterns. Continuous self-observation ensures that automatic interpretations remain aligned with objectives. It involves detecting subtle lapses, recognizing when default, negative patterns resurface, and gently reintroducing deliberate evaluation. This ongoing calibration preserves integrity and prevents cognitive drift back into old habits. Internal consistency supports integration as well. The mind operates most efficiently when thoughts, beliefs, and actions are coherent. Discrepancies between internal interpretations and external behaviors create friction, stress, and inefficiency. Alignment between cognitive patterns and actual behavior reinforces learning, strengthens confidence, and ensures that positive thinking produces tangible outcomes. Integration requires that what is thought matches what is done. Reflection is a crucial tool for embedding these processes. Periodic evaluation of both outcomes and strategies allows for fine-tuning, ensuring that positive thinking continues to evolve rather than stagnate. Reflection converts experience into structured knowledge, creating a continuous feedback loop that reinforces the mind's constructive tendencies. Without reflection, integration remains incomplete, as patterns may solidify without optimal alignment or adaptability. Integration also depends on resilience in the face of inconsistency. Life presents unpredictability, and even fully integrated cognitive systems encounter setbacks. True integration is tested when automatic positive frameworks are challenged. The strength of integration lies not in avoiding these challenges, but in maintaining cognitive protocols under stress, allowing for rapid recalibration and recovery without reverting to prior limitations. Finally, integration transforms thinking from a conscious strategy into a professional asset. The mind becomes a tool for consistent, precise, and adaptive decision-making. Thought patterns are no longer reactive or fragile. They operate seamlessly, producing measurable, constructive, and reliable outcomes in every sphere. Integration ensures that positive thinking is not episodic, optional, or temporary, but continuous, embedded, and self-reinforcing. By the end of this chapter, it is clear that integration is the bridge between capability and mastery. Awareness, restructuring, application, and optimization build the framework, but integration embeds it into the neural and behavioral systems, making positive thinking an automatic and enduring attribute. At this stage, it no longer requires effort to think constructively. It becomes the default operating mode, a professional-level advantage that influences every decision, action, and outcome. This is where positive thinking transitions from a skill to a standard, from a process to an identity, and from potential to realized, measurable excellence. Chapter 7. With integration achieved, the final dimension of advanced positive thinking is amplification. The ability to extend the benefits of constructive thought beyond personal outcomes and into sustained influence, innovation, and leadership. Amplification is not simply about thinking better. It is about using structured, high-functioning cognition to create measurable impact on a larger scale. It is the point at which the art of positive thinking evolves into strategic cognitive mastery that shapes environments, decisions, and results with precision. Amplification begins with influence. The way your mind interprets situations, frames responses, and generates solutions affects not only your own actions, but also the actions of those around you. When thinking is deliberate, accurate, and constructive, it naturally sets a tone that others absorb. In professional or social contexts, individuals who consistently model effective cognition establish credibility, foster collaboration, and inspire confidence. Influence is the multiplier of thought. The more accurate, adaptive, and consistent your thinking, the greater the impact it has externally. The second element is innovation. Constructive thinking creates mental space for creativity by reducing cognitive clutter and emotional interference. When automatic negative biases no longer dominate, the mind can explore possibilities that were previously overshadowed by fear, doubt, or assumption. Innovation emerges from the ability to combine accuracy, adaptability, and insight. It is not random creativity. It is creativity grounded in logic, evidence, and constructive interpretation. Amplified positive thinking turns challenges into opportunities for novel solutions, often uncovering paths that others fail to see. Decision-making is also magnified. Once cognitive patterns are optimized, applied, and integrated, choices are made with greater clarity, speed, and precision. Amplification means that these choices are not only individually effective, but strategically influential. It involves recognizing leverage points, predicting outcomes, and aligning multiple variables toward coherent results. Decisions are no longer reactive. They are proactive, calculated, and adaptive. The amplified thinker sees both immediate and systemic consequences simultaneously, ensuring that actions generate maximum effect. Another critical aspect is resilience at scale. Personal resilience becomes amplified when the cognitive system is consistently constructive and adaptive. Not only can you recover from setbacks quickly, but you can also sustain composure and strategic focus under prolonged or complex challenges. This resilience extends to teams, organizations, and projects. When a leader or influencer models cognitive stability, it propagates through their environment, reducing collective reactionary behaviors and enhancing group performance. Amplification is therefore both personal and systemic. Communication amplifies impact further. Thoughts, when effectively structured, can be translated into clear, persuasive, and actionable expression. This allows others to understand, adopt, and act upon insights efficiently. Amplified thinking transforms internal mastery into external effect. The ability to communicate reasoned, constructive, and solution-focused ideas increases influence, drives collaboration, and reinforces credibility. It is the vehicle through which positive thinking scales beyond the individual. Feedback loops are essential for maintaining amplification. High-functioning thinking is reinforced when outcomes, observations, and external responses are continuously evaluated. These loops ensure that cognitive strategies remain adaptive, precise, and aligned with both immediate objectives and long-term goals. They allow for dynamic calibration, preventing stagnation and enabling continuous improvement. Amplification thrives on iterative refinement. The system grows stronger as it interacts with increasingly complex scenarios. Another layer is systemic alignment. Amplification is not merely about personal gain. It is about aligning thinking with broader objectives, structures, or networks. Optimized, integrated, and constructive cognition can identify patterns, anticipate consequences, and harmonize efforts across multiple domains. The amplified thinker recognizes the interdependence of actions, decisions, and outcomes, ensuring that influence is strategically coherent and sustainable. Ethical and strategic consideration also become central. Amplification carries responsibility. The power to influence, innovate, and drive outcomes must be exercised with foresight and integrity. The professional application of positive thinking ensures that influence is constructive, innovation is purposeful, and decisions maximize value rather than merely serving personal or short-term interests. This alignment with ethics preserves credibility, strengthens relationships, and enhances long-term impact. Finally, amplification produces compounding benefits. Each successful interpretation, decision, or action builds a foundation for the next. Cognitive patterns that are constructive, integrated, and optimized reinforce themselves over time, creating momentum. Influence grows, resilience strengthens, innovation accelerates, and decision-making becomes increasingly precise. Positive thinking becomes a self-reinforcing system, capable of producing exponential results in both personal and professional domains. By the end of this chapter, it is clear that amplification represents the pinnacle of professional-level positive thinking. It transforms constructive thought into tangible influence, systematic innovation, and strategic excellence. The mind no longer reacts, adjusts, or merely functions. It leads, creates, and multiplies impact. At this stage, positive thinking transcends personal mastery. It becomes a force that shapes environments, decisions, and outcomes at scale. The art of thinking positively is complete when it not only enhances personal effectiveness, but also generates measurable value in the world around you, sustaining excellence far beyond individual effort. Mastery is not merely about achieving high performance in isolated periods. It is about maintaining clarity, constructive cognition, and strategic effectiveness over the long term, despite fluctuations, challenges, or environmental pressures. Sustainability ensures that all prior stages of positive thinking are preserved, reinforced, and resilient against regression. Sustainability begins with self-monitoring. Even when cognitive patterns are fully integrated and optimized, the mind is not static. Habits can erode, biases can resurface, and stressors can distort perception. Regular monitoring of thought patterns allows detection of subtle shifts before they undermine effectiveness. This is not self-criticism. It is a systematic check to ensure that interpretations, decisions, and actions remain aligned with goals and constructive principles. Energy management is another key factor. The capacity for deliberate, professional-level thinking depends on adequate cognitive resources. Mental fatigue, emotional depletion, and physical strain can reduce the effectiveness of even the most refined cognitive strategies. Sustainability requires deliberate allocation of energy, prioritizing high-value tasks, structuring periods for rest and recovery, and avoiding prolonged engagement with low-impact or emotionally draining situations. Optimized thinking becomes ineffective without proper energy maintenance. A further element is adaptability to evolving complexity. Situations change, challenges evolve, and unexpected variables arise. Sustainable positive thinking is flexible enough to recalibrate without losing its constructive foundation. This involves continuous learning, situational reassessment, and iterative adjustment of cognitive frameworks. Static thinking, even if previously effective, will eventually fail under dynamic conditions. Sustainability is the ability to maintain peak cognitive performance in a changing environment. Integration with long-term goals is equally critical. Short-term success can be achieved through temporary focus or isolated bursts of high-functioning thought, but sustainability requires alignment with enduring objectives. Each decision, interpretation, and action should reinforce a broader trajectory. Sustainable positive thinking ensures that the mental system remains coherent, consistently guiding behavior toward meaningful, strategic outcomes over time. Resilience remains central, but at a deeper level. Sustainability emphasizes endurance, not merely bouncing back from immediate setbacks, but maintaining constructive cognition over extended periods of challenge or uncertainty. This type of resilience depends on the integration of adaptive interpretations, emotional regulation, and iterative feedback mechanisms. The mind learns to persist without excessive fatigue or regression into previous negative patterns. Reflection and refinement continue to play a vital role. Sustainable thinking is not fixed, it evolves. Periodic assessment of strategies, interpretations, and outcomes allows for recalibration, ensuring that cognitive patterns remain effective in the face of new evidence or changing circumstances. Without this ongoing refinement, even highly effective positive thinking can become brittle and lose its efficacy. Another critical factor is influence management. Sustainability is reinforced by the people, systems, and structures with which you interact. Engaging with environments that support constructive thinking, collaborating with individuals who model adaptive cognition, and avoiding persistent exposure to negativity all contribute to the endurance of high-functioning thought. Environmental reinforcement stabilizes internal patterns and reduces cognitive decay. Habituation and ritualization also support sustainability. Embedding cognitive exercises, reflection practices, and strategic evaluations into routine behaviors ensures that positive thinking remains active even when attention is diverted or circumstances become challenging. Rituals create automatic reinforcement, reducing the effort required to maintain constructive cognitive patterns and protecting against lapses. Finally, sustainability requires an understanding of the compounding effect of cognitive consistency. Small, deliberate interventions repeated over time produce exponential results. Each maintained pattern strengthens neural pathways, reinforces constructive interpretations, and enhances decision-making efficiency. The combination of energy management, reflection, adaptability, and environmental alignment ensures that positive thinking does not merely exist. It thrives, self-reinforcing and resilient across both predictable and unpredictable conditions. By the end of this chapter, it is clear that sustainability is the stage at which professional positive thinking becomes enduring. Awareness, restructuring, application, optimization, integration, and amplification all serve as foundations. But sustainability ensures that these foundations remain stable, functional, and adaptive indefinitely. The art of positive thinking is fully realized, not when it is merely practiced, optimized, or influential, but when it endures. Sustained, constructive cognition becomes a permanent feature of mental functioning, a reliable tool for navigating complexity, achieving objectives, and producing long-term, measurable excellence. This is the ultimate expression of mastery, where positive thinking is no longer a skill. It is an enduring, self-reinforcing system capable of delivering consistent results under any circumstance. Chapter 9. At this stage, it becomes evident that positive thinking is no longer simply a personal tool. It evolves into a strategic system for decision-making, performance, and influence. The previous chapters laid the foundation: awareness, restructuring, application, optimization, integration, amplification, and sustainability. Now, the focus is on mastery in practice. The seamless execution of all these principles simultaneously to produce consistent, high-level outcomes. This chapter explores how to synthesize all prior steps into a unified approach that functions automatically, efficiently, and effectively in every aspect of life. Mastery begins with the principle of anticipation. The mind of a professional-level positive thinker does not react after events occur. It predicts, evaluates, and prepares for possible scenarios. Anticipation is rooted in accurate observation, adaptive framing, and prior experience. By mentally simulating potential outcomes, weighing probabilities, and preparing responses, the mind minimizes reactive stress and maximizes readiness. Anticipatory thinking converts uncertainty into actionable insight, reducing wasted effort and preserving focus for what truly matters. Strategic alignment is the next critical factor. Thoughts, emotions, and actions are fully synchronized with objectives. Every decision, interpretation, and behavior is guided by coherent goals. Misalignment between mental patterns and desired outcomes produces friction, inefficiency, and unpredictability. Mastery eliminates this friction by ensuring that cognitive, emotional, and behavioral systems operate in unison. The result is clarity, decisiveness, and measurable effectiveness across complex situations. Another dimension is precision in evaluation. By this stage, automatic negative or biased responses are minimal, and every interpretation is deliberate, evidence-based, and contextually relevant. Precision allows for sharper problem-solving, faster decision-making, and a higher likelihood of successful outcomes. It is the difference between generalized optimism and targeted, actionable insight. Mastery is achieved when positive thinking functions with surgical accuracy, influencing both thought and action at optimal levels. Emotional intelligence is now fully integrated into cognition. Emotions are neither ignored nor blindly followed. They are recognized as data points that inform interpretation, decision-making, and behavioral response. Emotional regulation is automatic, allowing constructive engagement even in high-pressure scenarios. Anxiety, frustration, or excitement become signals for adjustment rather than obstacles. The professional thinker leverages emotions to enhance focus, energy, and strategic clarity. Flexibility remains a hallmark. Mastery is not rigidity, it is adaptive precision. Circumstances change, environments fluctuate, and unforeseen challenges emerge. The advanced thinker remains fluid, capable of recalibrating without compromising principles. Flexibility ensures that high-functioning cognitive patterns are preserved across dynamic conditions, preventing breakdown or regression. The mind becomes a system that continuously adapts, refines, and optimizes itself in real time. Communication and influence are amplified at this level. Mastery enables ideas to be articulated with clarity, impact, and strategic effect. It transforms constructive thinking into tangible outcomes in interpersonal, organizational, and social contexts. Persuasion, negotiation, and leadership become extensions of the mind's optimized operations. Positive thinking now affects not only internal performance, but also the functioning of entire teams, projects, and systems. Reflection and refinement continue, but they become more strategic. The professional thinker does not merely review events. Patterns are analyzed for long-term improvement, lessons are codified, and adaptive strategies are embedded into future scenarios. Iterative improvement is now faster, more precise, and more effective because prior stages have reduced bias, enhanced attention, and refined interpretation. Learning occurs at both micro and macro levels, ensuring exponential growth over time. Finally, mastery manifests in effortless integration. The principles of positive thinking, awareness, restructuring, application, optimization, integration, amplification, sustainability, operate as a coherent system rather than discrete steps. Automaticity is achieved. The mind functions with minimal conscious intervention, yet each thought, decision, and action is aligned, deliberate, and effective. Constructive cognition becomes the default state, producing consistent, measurable excellence across all domains. By the end of this chapter, it is clear that mastery represents the apex of positive thinking. It is the stage where the art becomes science, the skill becomes system, and the practice becomes identity. The mind operates with precision, influence, resilience, and adaptability, producing outcomes that are reliable, impactful, and enduring. Professional positive thinking is complete when it moves beyond reaction or effortful control. It becomes an integrated, self-reinforcing, high-performance cognitive system capable of sustaining excellence, generating influence, and navigating complexity with precision. This is the ultimate expression of the art, mastery in practice, where positive thinking is no longer applied, it is realized. Chapter 10. Legacy begins with modeling. The thoughts, behaviors, and decisions of a professional thinker set a standard that others naturally observe and emulate. When constructive cognition is consistently demonstrated, it becomes a reference point for peers, teams, and collaborators. Modeling is more than leading by example. It is creating an environment in which constructive thought is expected, encouraged, and normalized. Through this process, positive thinking extends beyond the individual, influencing systems, communities, and organizational culture. Mentorship and guidance further amplify impact. Legacy is reinforced when knowledge and strategies are shared with others, allowing them to adopt, refine, and apply principles effectively. Teaching positive thinking is not merely about conveying ideas. It is about structuring experience, observation, and practice into actionable frameworks that others can internalize. The mentor becomes a catalyst, accelerating cognitive development and producing ripple effects that expand influence exponentially. System creation is another essential element. The mind of a professional thinker naturally develops processes, routines, and protocols that maximize constructive cognition. Legacy involves formalizing these systems so they endure independently of the individual. This could take the form of strategic planning models, decision-making frameworks, feedback mechanisms, or structured learning processes. By institutionalizing these systems, positive thinking becomes embedded in structures and processes that survive beyond the moment, ensuring continuity and consistency. Sustainable influence depends on understanding results, iterating strategies, and adapting systems based on outcomes. Legacy is strengthened when the effects of constructive thinking are visible, measurable, and demonstrable. This allows for the ongoing optimization of systems and ensures that influence is not static, but evolves alongside changing circumstances and challenges. Influence extends beyond immediate circles. Legacy-level thinking considers both short-term and long-term effects, as well as direct and indirect consequences of cognitive strategies. It evaluates the broader ecosystem, social, organizational, and structural, and identifies leverage points where interventions produce maximal systemic benefit. In this sense, positive thinking becomes strategic architecture rather than isolated effort. Every decision, action, and pattern contributes to the enduring integrity of the system. Sustainability at this level is critical. Legacy requires that the principles of constructive cognition remain effective over time and across different contexts. This involves continuous reinforcement, environmental alignment, and periodic recalibration to ensure that the systems created remain robust. Cognitive excellence is preserved when practices, frameworks, and models are resilient to disruption, scalable to complexity, and adaptable to unforeseen circumstances. Reflection and codification are essential tools. By documenting processes, insights, and strategies, the professional thinker ensures that knowledge is preserved and transferable. This converts personal mastery into collective benefit, allowing others to access and implement principles without the need to reinvent the process. Codification transforms ephemeral experience into enduring frameworks that extend influence indefinitely. Finally, legacy embodies the principle of generativity. Mastery becomes meaningful only when it contributes to growth beyond the self. By creating systems, mentoring others, and modeling high-functioning cognition, professional positive thinking becomes a self-perpetuating force that elevates both individuals and environments. Legacy ensures that constructive thought does not end with the thinker, but continues to generate value, influence, and measurable outcomes for the long term. At the conclusion of this chapter, it is clear that legacy is the ultimate stage of professional positive thinking. It is where personal mastery intersects with enduring impact, transforming cognition into a sustainable, systemic force. Positive thinking ceases to be solely an individual advantage. It becomes a tool for shaping environments, influencing behaviors, and creating outcomes that persist far beyond the immediate context. This is the culmination of the art, a system that begins within, expands outward, and continues to generate measurable excellence indefinitely. Positive thinking, when mastered and extended, is not just a skill, it is a legacy.